Hi, I'm Paco Nathan with O'Reilly Media, and it's a pleasure today to get to speak with a good friend, Amy Heineike from Primer AI. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Um, we've been around data science and big data and machine learning. It's been a few years now. I recall. I think we probably met around 2012-ish, somewhere back there.
Something like, yeah, maybe even a little bit earlier. I think I started working on my first startup in about 2008, 2009.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so much has changed and evolved. I'd love to get your perspectives on how this is all rolling out now that AI is a popular media buzzword.
Yeah.
A lot of your work is in NLP also.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that there's a lot of discussion about deep learning and consequences of AI in industry and all, but deep learning is something that's also evolving, NLP is something that's evolving very rapidly.
Yeah, that's right. And I think if you look at like image analysis, after ImageNet came out, there was some enormous breakthroughs, and the state of the art there is very advanced, but NLP's kind of lagged that for a while. And I think what we're starting to see is there's a really rapid pace of publication going on. And especially recently there's been some much more successful applications of transfer learning and other concepts that seem like they've got the opportunity to push the field forward pretty significantly. So I think it's a very exciting time. It's also kind of a time when a lot of the foundational pieces are starting to get much better. So you can pull an off-the-shelf software library like Spacey, for example, and it can do a really good job of take a sentence, figure out what that sentence is about, what are the parts of speech, how do they relate to each other, what are the entities. So because you can do those foundational pieces, now you can start to spend more of your time on the creative piece where you're thinking, well, how do I want to leverage that? You know, what's the product that we could build? And so that makes it really fun, right? You're not worrying all the time.
The business case, not being tied to the pipeline, but actually thinking more about the business case.
Thinking more about the business case, absolutely. So it feels like we work with clients in a bunch of industries, and what we find is everybody we sit down with, we talk about what we can do, and then they basically say, yes, I have a huge pile of text.
All of the above?
We have all of this text. And then they sheepishly say, we're meant to read it, but we don't. We don't even know what's in it. And so there's just tons of use cases out there where people are overwhelmed, and normally they end up just skipping stuff and skipping stuff. And so there's a huge need for this stuff to get applied.
Right.
But it's only just getting to the place where you can start to think about applying it. And in applying it, you have to spend a chunk of your time learning about all of these new frameworks that are coming out and reading all these papers to try and stay on top of this wave of research that's coming through. So it's kind of an exciting, it's a really exciting time.
Sort of a giant scientific habit trail, just running around in the loop. Well, I'm curious too, I mean, from the customer's perspective, I think often we'll talk about data exhaust, or people will talk about that. And it's somewhat of a dismissive term, but it does sound like a huge opportunity from what you're describing also.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that I really like about text is, so we often work with long form text. So this is a report that somebody wrote. Yeah. So if you think about like a whole company full of analysts, so maybe it's in the intelligence space, or financial analysts, they're making really important decisions, and then analysts are writing really thoughtful reports where they're highlighting, what matters that's happening in the world. And so, text is the way that it's getting communicated, but underneath that are these really deep stories about what's happening. So I've spent a lot of time in the last few years thinking about narrative. How do you tell stories? What are the important points that you want to communicate? And we actually have a few people on our team who've come from the journalist world. So one guy was a science journalist for 15 years, and another was a visualization expert, so he created visualizations for the New York Times and the Guardian. And so, we'll have conversations with them, and they'll say like, in a newsroom, the way that we'd go through this process of understanding what was going on and then communicating the story would be this, right? What's that process? And so, it's kind of fascinating to find this place that's at this intersection of kind of storytelling and then like hardcore mathematics.
I've never heard this before, but what you're describing, the newsroom is sort of the model for like summarization and natural language understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, and the kind of analyst, what does an analyst do, right? They read all this stuff, and then they figure out what's significant, and then, so, one level of the task is just summarize what's going on there. Really good analysts, really good analysts will try and figure out the so what of that.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for our business? And that's hard, right? I don't know that we should even expect that we want to automate that away. Like maybe you want to have people go through that process, but to get there, they have to do all this like trawling around and finding stuff. There's this huge research stage. So they're spending like hours and hours, days and days, just trawling through stuff, trying to find the inputs to their process. And then they do this really interesting thing where they try and understand what's important from all of that. And that's what we want to help. But absolutely the analyst workflow we think about a lot. They're not only individuals either, they're normally teams. So you think of intelligence, right? Intelligence at advanced scales is, it's normally a team endeavor. And there's a bunch of processes around that. So you have people with different roles. So you'll have a junior analyst or more specialist analyst they'll be tracking particular companies or particular pieces of the world, and they'll know everything that's happening there. And then their job will be to figure out the most important things and share those with their colleagues. And then they'll get together in a room and decide of all of this stuff, what's the most important of that we need to highlight? And when is there something so important that we need to do something about it immediately? Or when does this fit into a long-term trend that we need to get together and think about? It's just interesting. So I think newsrooms do this and disseminate to large groups of people, right? They're telling the world what they think is important. And then internally in organizations, intelligence teams are maybe doing this for executives or strategy teams. So kind of narrowed down to what's the last important thing. So we actually think about probably the ultimate summary, and it takes about 100,000 people to make this. Crazily, is the daily presidential briefing in the U.S.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Because it's it's condensing everything that is known about what's important across the world, right?
The most expensive and provocative summaries in the world.
In the world, right?
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, at AI conferences, people talk about understanding the brain and the structure of the brain, and can we make something artificial that mimics that? Right. But what you're describing is more of a kind of collaborative intelligence or collective intelligence. Mm-hmm. And that isn't about how the neurons are wired as much as it is about how we as people use linguistics to work together. Right. And thus back into NLP in the linguistics domain.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we started Primer, so I had some conversations with Sean, who's the CEO, and he'd had this idea that we really wanted to do text generation. And it wasn't clear that this was possible. And I remember a series of conversations with my husband where he's like, this is crazy. Like, why don't you just put data in a table? Like, it's much easier in a chart, right? Like, why do you want to generate text? And I think it wasn't clear to me that we'd make much progress with this either, right? It seems kind of mad. And in fact, when I talk to experts in NLP, or have done over the last few years, normally they're the most skeptical about what we're doing because they're like, this sounds really, really hard. But what's interesting is that when you think about these communities of people, text is what they're handing back and forth, right?
Yes.
It's certainly not a dashboard or like high-level charts. It's text because it's conclusions and thought. And when you have that as your goal, one of the interesting things is so it's one thing to build a dashboard or a series of analysis and visualizations of your data. It's another to say what of all of that should be the first sentence at the top of a document, right? Yeah. And so this question about significance is actually the most important one about summarization.
Interesting.
So the first thing you have to do is say, well, what matters? So I'm going to take my 10,000 documents, pull them apart, figure out everything, structure everything I can about them, look for signals in all kinds of ways. And then I'm going to answer which thing of this seems to be the most important.
Is that purely a matter of text, or is this introducing notions of, say, knowledge graph to try to understand where the significance is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on use case partly, and on the kinds of signals that may be present in the data, or maybe things that people look for. So for news, for example, when something important happens, lots of people write about it. Yeah. So actually knowing that important sources wrote about this thing,
Right. Okay.
and that often all happens at the same time, is a really sure signal that, hey, this thing is a big deal.
Gotcha.
So there's a thing called a 10K filing that every
Right.
American
SEC.
company has to file to the SEC.
Yeah.
So these are really long, and most
Impossible
people
to
who
read.
read them like have to do this with like highlighter pens and post-it notes. It turns out it's like very painful to read them. What's interesting there is if you look year to year, they don't change very much. So the differences between them are really significant, because that's the company saying like, you know, oh, actually there was a huge lawsuit this year that we really have to disclose, so we're going to make that change.
Interesting.
Or we acquired a Chinese company, and so now we're subject to Chinese regulation or something like that. And so, so in that case, significance may be, you know, where the edits are and where they kind of updated something. You know, in some cases, significance is kind of a classification problem. It's like, you know, if there's a stream of news about a company and one of the news articles about them talks about the fact that they just got a major data breach, you know, actually, even if that only got, you know, talked about in one document, that's probably important. So it depends, but there's a couple of ways of getting at it.
So some topics, classification of certain topics could be particularly poignant. If it's about a company and there's a data breach, or something that has a downstream significance.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned about summarization, and maybe for people who aren't doing as much day-to-day in NLP, how does that fit in? What's that?
happening with summarization?
Yeah.
So summarization is a really interesting problem. So so we think a lot about multi-document summarization, which is hard. So there is a lot of there are more and more papers about this, and there's been some really interesting progress. So Google had a big paper in February, which is pretty fun to read. So roughly speaking, there are three kinds of summarization. So the first one, I should say text generation. There's three types of text generation that people do. So the first one is template-based text generation. So the idea is you write a sentence that's got gaps in it, and then you go and structure data, and you drop the facts into the sentence.
Gotcha.
So this means that rather than having a table with those facts in, you can just represent it in a sentence. And this is actually a really nice way to summarize, or to maybe more to synthesize, condense information you can structure about a corpus. And you can make this pretty rich, surprisingly rich. So you can learn what those templates should look like from the text.
Oh, really?
Or you can combine together bits of phrases to make new kinds of sentences. And you can prioritize which sentences based on how interesting they seem to be after you've generated them. So you can actually create a system which is very rich. So that's the first type. The second type of text generation is extractive summarization. So in an extractive model, what you do is you start with all your corpuses of text. And what you're trying to do is find phrases and sentences that you can pull out and put back together again and give you a block of text.
So the Frankenstein option.
Yeah. So what's cool is you can use a number of different kinds of signals to figure out which fragments are important. So, well, you know, you're an expert on some of this.
I love that, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, there are some signals that come from within the text that indicate which things might be important. But you can also use external signals. So, you know, some of the sources very interesting, or are entities that are being covered are particularly important for some reason, or something like this.
Is it from the title? Is it from the abstract? That kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can use a lot of different signals to figure out which kind of sentences. And then you need some level of model to try and help you make sure that your Frankenstein fits together well. Right. Something. The last style is abstractive, and there's been a lot of really cool research on this in the last few years. So the idea is you build some kind of sequence-to-sequence model where the input is a lot of text and the output is a small amount of text. So it's kind of like a translation algorithm. It's just translating from a lot of text to a small amount of text rather than one language to the other. And what's actually, some of the advances recently have been that those models can fall back onto just extracting text.
Oh, interesting.
So if they can't figure out new ways to combine,
Yeah.
they just pull original content.
Interesting.
So this is what Google's paper included.
The sequence-to-sequence paper?
So their summarization paper in February leveraged some of these ideas. So there's a pointer model that helps do this kind of fallback to extractive summarization if the abstractive is not working super well. So there's some really interesting research around here. Now, what's interesting is that this sometimes fails pretty nastily. So that's fun. The other thing that's kind of challenging is it can be hard to know exactly where everything came from. And sourcing is really important. So where exactly did my information come from? So I think where we're really excited at the moment is actually hybrids between all of these systems. So you can kind of figure out what the best that you can get from each one of them is, and then figure out how you can combine them together. So
who makes the determination then, or how is a determination made that one approach is better than the other for a given output?
So I think so some of this depends on the use case and what you're trying to achieve, and I think it's something that we can also train and learn about, right? So we can see which one's working.
Yeah.
So it depends on the context. But yeah, it's a really interesting space, and it's kind of amazing that we're making progress on it at the moment.
Oh, fascinating. I mean, it seems like such a characteristically human thing to write a story.
Yeah.
And seeing this kind of natural language generation, seeing it actually work, it's eerie in some ways to me.
Well, and I think, one of the things that makes it so hard is it's really hard to measure how well you're doing.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of standard metrics called rouge and blue that
Right.
people use, but they're mainly getting at are the words in the summary words that you want to have included, which doesn't really tell you anything about the logical flow or how the paragraph works. So people often then have to just fall back on having people read it and then scoring what they like. But the fact that that measure is hard to nail down I think indicates how hard this problem is, right? Because it's such a human thing to do.
And I can imagine some of the failure cases are hilarious.
Yeah.
If you get the right set of words and just sort of scramble them. Does that lead to, say, human-in-the-loop kinds of scenarios then, where you've got people engaged in evaluating the results?
One way we've thought about this is one of our goals has been to create software that can draft a report as well as a junior analyst can.
Interesting, okay.
So if we can draft that report for you, then it's more of an input into this community process.
Right.
So I don't know, this is kind of a rich way of thinking about this, right? Because it might be that the next step is for somebody to actually completely riff off of it. It's like an interesting input, and then they're going to create that kind of refined final report. Or maybe it's enough for them to have kind of this rough draft, like they got that instantly and they can kind of move on. But there's definitely some interesting loops through the business of, how does this information then kind of propagate through the team, and where does the human editing come, and where does the automated editing come, and then actually what happens over time. So if you made a report today, it's out of date tomorrow.
Right.
So maybe the system can notice that, hey, there's new content, and put that alongside your human edited version. Yeah, so I think there's just a lot of richness here in terms of user experience as well as the algorithm piece.
I can imagine that design becomes very much of a priority because exactly that. You have to have people working comfortably with what the machines produce.
Yeah.
I'm curious too, out of the 3 different areas of extraction, are any of them surging ahead of the pack, or are they all kind of neck and neck?
The 3 text generation approaches. Yeah, I think I think there's probably the most academic interest on the extractive summarization. So I think we're seeing a lot of that at the moment. I think templated stuff is probably used more extensively in industry, but it's maybe not published about so much.
Interesting, and the ability to learn and generate templates also sounds like a very sophisticated process.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine that has a long way to go, and everybody's terrified of going over the deep end.
think about what would be possible there in terms of style, right?
Right.
And learning the different ways that people create summaries. Yeah, I think there's a lot. There's just a hugely rich ground here for exploring. Yeah, lots of fun problems.
Fantastic. Let's see. Oh, yeah, another question I had was, I'm really curious about your perspectives on how this has been changing over time, and if there's any sort of truisms that you, lenses that you can look through what's changing to give you guidance. Sorry, small question.
Easy question, yeah. One thing that's been very interesting in all the work we do is just seeing the breadth of skills and the number of kind of domains you hit on when you're building these products. So actually one thing that was kind of fun for Primer is when we started out, we had a very small team for quite a long time. So we built everything. I spun up our first server and then we deployed Elasticsearch on it and then tried to ingest all the data. So, you end up doing all these different things. So a bit of it's algorithm design, a bit of it's product design, a bit of it's deployment, a bunch of it's data munging and thinking about data. So you have all these different things, and actually one of the huge pleasures of being in and privileges, I think, of being in a startup is when you've had a small team, you've had to build everything, and then you start growing and you hire in people who are experts, and then you look with awe as they make Jenkins run continuous integration in a beautiful, beautiful way, and you think, wow, this is incredible. So, seeing people with expertise in these different fields come in is interesting. But you have to somehow bring all of this together. And I think that's been true for a long time, that, building a data product took all these different skill sets. Right. But as different parts of it get more and more specialized, that's a huge amount to learn. And I think when we're hiring, we often think about this. People have, they're specialist in some part of the problem domain, right? They know a lot about machine learning algorithms, or they know how to deploy stuff, or whatever it is. So they never come in knowing everything they need to know to do the job. And so I think, that's been fascinating. That you need kind of a real mix of skills to kind of come together to be able to pull it off. And even within the algorithm space, we find, the chunk of the algorithms we're using are machine learning, deep learning models, but actually quite a few of them are optimization algorithms, right? They're, we end up doing a lot of pairwise comparisons, and so... You're making a lot of choices amongst good candidates, but you have to pick which. Right, so there may be ranking algorithms, there may be many types. So we actually have a lot of computational scientists in the team. So we have one guy who's a computational astronomer, and it turns out he knows a lot about just-in-time compilation and ways to optimize double for loops, which turns out to be really useful. And then we have people who are computational biologists who've just stared at ugly data and really messy data for a long time. And it turns out this is really useful. And so, but this is a challenge, I think. If you come in and you try and build one of these systems, having all of these skill sets accounted for, how do you get there? Are you actively cross-training people who might come in and say, someone has expertise in a particular area, they're doing deep learning, but gosh, they don't really know the Jenkins all that well, and they're going to need to. Are you doing a lot of cross-training along those lines? Yeah, that absolutely happens. So people come in, so we look for people who have kind of a depth and skill somewhere, and then who are kind of curious about other pieces of it. And so, people end up just learning a huge range of things as they go through. So that's absolutely happening. I think actually, so one thing that's been interesting is if you look back to the people who were kind of data scientists back in 2008, 2009, it's actually interesting to see how many of them became kind of, who built kind of software infrastructure for data science afterwards. Oh, that is interesting. Like Jay Krebs, who went and built Kafka, right? So I think sometimes people come in and they're really interested in one part of the problem, and then they realize that, hey, actually, that other thing is this actually thing is actually a really cool problem. There's just kind of a lot of different problems to get stuck into.
Interesting. Well, I mean, that has implications because now we're seeing data science go mainstream. Like we had Strata New York, I think that was last month, and one of the takeaways was it's much larger and a lot of people had never been there before.
Yeah.
And it was real mainstream kind of businesses who were encountering ideas and going, well, I've never considered that. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so now what's going to happen with a lot of new data scientists also seeing, wow, there's opportunity. I should go work on this for 5 years. Sorry, I'm babbling.
No, it's cool. No, it's really cool. I think there's a lot for us to figure out still about what's possible and how you do it well and what it means.
What strikes me is that I hear the term AI talked about a lot, and I also hear various speakers attempting to define it. But when I look at what your team has done, this is truly an AI system, and it is a very complex system. So, kudos to you, but also I think that your perspectives on this to reflect on what does it mean to build an AI system as opposed to, oh, I've just built a TensorFlow model.
Right. Yeah, and I think, so our use cases are around, and they're normally around people who want to learn about the world. Yeah. So we really are getting straight into the intelligence problem, right, in a very direct way. How do you help somebody understand what the heck is going on out there? And most of the toolkit people have is kind of search and document retrieval. Like they know, they can go and find the fact. But if they don't want to find one fact, they just want to get a lay of the land. There's not so many tools out there for that. So, yes, absolutely, we're thinking about it. And actually, I think that's been, so we're a 65-person startup now at Primer.
Oh, it was 50 last time I checked.
I know, it's growing. We're growing. But it's been, so one thing that's cool is like we're very engineering heavy, and even within the engineering team, we very, a lot of people have these deep algorithm or machine learning kind of backgrounds, and so we just get to think about these problems all day long. Like that is the product. The whole product is around how do you make people smarter. Yeah.
Excellent. And definitely intelligence is a team sport. That's one of my takeaways today.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.